There is a particular kind of place that history produces only rarely. A place so improbable, so concentrated in its chaos and its colour and its defiance of every norm the surrounding world was trying to impose, that it seems less like a real location than like something a novelist invented on a particularly inspired afternoon. Tonight we're going to talk about one of those places, a small island in the Caribbean, barely 20 miles long and 5 miles wide at its widest point, that for a stretch of several decades in the 17th century was the most dangerous, the most lawless, the most furiously alive piece of real estate in the Atlantic world. An island that was, depending on which decade you visited and which way the political winds were blowing, a French colony, a Spanish colony, an English colony, a no man's land, and simultaneously none of those things and something that none of those categories quite contained. An island whose harbour held the ships of men who owed allegiance to no king and feared no navy, and whose professional specialty was the systematic plunder of the richest maritime trade route in the world. Tonight we are talking about Tortuga, the island of the turtle, the pirate capital of the Caribbean, a place that was real, that you can visit today, that has roads and villages and fishermen going about their business. And that was also, for a few extraordinary decades, the closest thing the 17th century produced to the end of the world. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. The image of this drifting over different latitudes simultaneously, some of you in the deep hours of the night and some of you just settling in for the evening, is one I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that low background hum. Let the room go soft. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back, way back, to the morning the Spanish arrived in the Caribbean and made, without knowing it, the series of decisions that would eventually produce the island we're here to discuss. The Caribbean that Columbus entered in 1492 was not empty. It was home to several distinct peoples, the Taino, the Siboney, the island Caribs, whose civilizations had been developing in the islands and along the coasts of the Caribbean basin for thousands of years before any European had the slightest awareness of their existence. The Taino in particular occupied most of the Greater Antilles, the large islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico and Jamaica, in communities organised around a chieftain system called the cacique, sustained by agriculture centred on the cultivation of cassava, sweet potatoes and maize, and characterised by a social sophistication that the Spanish explorers consistently underestimated because it did not take the forms that European civilization had trained them to recognise as sophistication. The Taino had no writing, they had no metal weapons, they had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, no ocean-going sailing ships. What they had was a densely networked social world, an elaborate cosmology, a material culture of considerable refinement in ceramics and woven goods, and populations that on the island of Hispaniola alone likely numbered somewhere between 500,000 and several million people. Scholars have debated the estimates extensively, and the truth is uncertain, but the certainty is that it was a lot of people. Within a century of Columbus's arrival, almost all of them were dead. The causes were multiple and are still debated in their relative weighting, but the broad outlines are not in serious dispute. European epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, moved through populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no developed immune response with a speed and lethality that had no precedent in the Americas. The Spanish colonial system, which reduced the surviving indigenous population to a condition of forced labour through the encomienda arrangement, by which Spanish colonists were granted the labour of specified numbers of indigenous people in exchange for nominal obligations of Christianization and protection that were honoured poorly or not at all, killed through overwork, malnutrition, and the systematic destruction of the social structures that had sustained indigenous communities. Violence was a contributing factor, but probably not the dominant one, except in specific local episodes of extraordinary brutality. The combination of epidemic and forced labour produced, within roughly 50 years of Columbus's arrival, a demographic catastrophe of a scale and speed that had not occurred anywhere in the world since the Black Death. The reason this matters for the story of Tortuga is that the erasure of the indigenous population created a vacuum, a set of islands that had been densely inhabited and were now, in most of their interior regions, effectively empty of any population capable of resisting European claims or exploitation. The Spanish, who were the first European power to establish significant colonial presence in the Caribbean, made a set of choices about which of these islands were worth developing and which were not that would shape the subsequent history of the entire region. Hispaniola, the large island that today contains both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and whose northern shore faces the small island of Tortuga across a narrow channel, was one of the early centres of Spanish colonial activity. Its capital, Santo Domingo, founded in 1498, was the first permanent European city in the Americas and the administrative centre of Spain's early Caribbean empire. But as the silver mines of Mexico and Peru drew Spanish colonial attention and investment westward and southward in the early 16th century, Hispaniola and the other Greater Antilles became secondary concerns. The Spanish maintained settlements, maintained administrative presence, but reduced their investment in the islands that were not producing the spectacular returns that the mainland silver economy was generating. The island of Tortuga sits about 5 miles off the northern coast of Hispaniola. Its name in Spanish, La Tortuga, the turtle, came from its shape as seen from the sea. The silhouette of the island's central ridge, rising sharply from the water, resembled to the early explorers the shell of a sea turtle in profile. It was discovered, named, and then largely ignored by the Spanish throughout the 16th century. It had no silver. It had no gold. It had fresh water, timber, and a harbour on its southern coast that was sheltered enough to be serviceable but not remarkable enough to attract systematic development. The Spanish made no permanent settlement there. They came occasionally, cut wood, watered their ships, and left. The island sat for most of the 16th century in the practical sovereignty of no one, claimed by Spain as a matter of imperial principle, occupied by Spain not at all, growing its forests and sheltering its turtles and its wild pigs in magnificent indifference to the colonial politics of the mainland. The wild pigs were, as it turned out, important. They were descended from animals that Spanish ships had released or lost on Hispaniola and the surrounding islands in the early colonial period, a standard practice intended to create food reserves for future expeditions. The pigs had bred freely across the unclaimed interior of Hispaniola, and their descendants ranged across the island in large numbers by the early 17th century, along with similarly feral cattle. The existence of these animals would attract the first Europeans to make a regular life on the northern coast of Hispaniola and the island of Tortuga, men who came to hunt and who had become, over the course of several generations, something that the Spanish Empire had not anticipated and could not quite find the administrative category to contain. The men who would eventually be called Buccaneers arrived in the northern coast of Hispaniola in the early decades of the 17th century with no particular political agenda and no specific plan. They were, in the early period, an accidental community. Deserters from ships, escaped indentured servants, shipwreck survivors, men who had simply run out of other places to be, and found themselves on an island where the living was rough but technically free. They came from France, from England, from the Netherlands, and from various points of uncertain national origin, and their shared characteristic was not nationality or religion or political allegiance, but the practical circumstance of being in the same ungoverned place with the same immediate problem: how to eat. The answer was hunting. The northern coast of Hispaniola and the nearby islands, including Tortuga, offered enormous quantities of feral cattle and pigs in terrain that Spanish colonial authority had neither the interest nor the manpower to control. The technique these hunters developed for preserving their meat was borrowed directly from the Arawak indigenous people, who had inhabited the islands before the Spanish arrived. One of the many threads of indigenous cultural knowledge that survived the demographic catastrophe in the practices of those who came after. They smoked their meat on wooden frames over slow fires, a process that produced a preserved product capable of lasting weeks without refrigeration in the tropical climate, and the frame they used for this smoking was called, in the Arawak-derived word that passed into French, a boucan. The men who smoked meat on boucans were Buccaneers, Buccaneers. The word that would eventually become synonymous with Caribbean piracy began as a description of a smoking technique. The men who became the most feared maritime predators of the 17th century were, in their origins, a community of meat smokers living rough on an ungoverned island and trading dried beef and pork to passing ships. The Buccaneers in their early form, from roughly the 1620s through the 1640s, were not pirates. They were hunters who sold their product. The ships that bought from them were often not Spanish, because Spain maintained a strict mercantilist monopoly on trade with its Caribbean colonies that was deeply inconvenient for the other European nations trying to participate in Caribbean commerce, and the non-Spanish ships that were willing to trade in the islands in defiance of Spanish commercial regulations naturally sought out the ungoverned spaces where Spanish authority could not interfere. Tortuga, with its sheltered harbour and its proximity to the hunting grounds of northern Hispaniola, became one of the natural points of exchange between the hunters on shore and the traders at sea. The community there was fluid and impermanent in its early decades. Men came and went with the seasons and the opportunities, living in rough shelters, hunting during the day, eating and drinking and gambling around fires at night, maintaining a culture whose specific social rules and codes would take another generation to fully articulate. The Spanish noticed. They could not fail to notice. The unauthorized settlements of foreign nationals on the island they claimed as their own were a violation of the imperial principle that Spain maintained sole sovereignty over the entire Caribbean, a principle that the other European powers disputed in theory, and that the Buccaneers were disputing in the most practical possible way, by simply being there and not leaving. Spanish forces raided the northern Hispaniola settlements multiple times in the 1620s and 1630s, killing hunters, burning their camps and equipment, destroying the boucans and slaughtering or driving off the livestock they depended on. The raids were effective in the short term and entirely ineffective in the strategic long term, because the men they failed to kill or capture simply moved to Tortuga, whose geography was more defensible, whose harbour could take the small vessels the Buccaneers used, and whose relative isolation made Spanish land raids logistically difficult and Spanish naval blockade expensive to maintain. Every time the Spanish cleared the hunters from Hispaniola's northern coast, the hunters regrouped on Tortuga, waited, and came back. The relationship between the Buccaneer community on Tortuga and the political ambitions of France, England, and the Netherlands in the Caribbean was mutually convenient in ways that neither party would have found entirely comfortable to acknowledge openly. The European powers wanted a foothold in the Caribbean that Spain claimed as its own. The Buccaneers wanted protection from Spanish raids and access to markets for their goods, and increasingly their services. The unofficial arrangement that developed, in which European colonial entrepreneurs used the Buccaneer community as both a labour force and a military resource for establishing footholds in the region, was a mechanism by which the Caribbean slowly opened to non-Spanish European settlement, despite Spain's theoretical monopoly on the whole thing. Tortuga was one of the hinge points of this process, and its specific history is a compressed version of the broader story of how the Spanish Caribbean ceased to be exclusively Spanish. In 1625, a French entrepreneur named Pierre Belin des Nambucks arrived on the island of St. Kitts, which he and his English counterpart Thomas Warner jointly settled as the first successful French and English colony in the Caribbean. The St. Kitts arrangement was a microcosm of what the non-Spanish European powers were trying to do: establish themselves in the Spanish-claimed Caribbean without having the naval resources to directly confront Spain, by choosing islands that Spain had not bothered to effectively occupy, and presenting the occupation as a fait accompli that was more trouble to reverse than to tolerate. the same logic applied to Tortuga. By the early 1630s, both French and English settlers, using the word settler loosely to describe communities whose primary activities were still hunting and trading rather than agriculture, were present on the island, and the question of which European power would eventually claim it was being worked out through the same mixture of opportunism, inter-European rivalry, and Spanish hostility that characterised the entire early Caribbean colonial period. The first English claim to Tortuga was established in 1631 when an English colonial company sent a small group of settlers to the island. The settlement lasted only a few years before a Spanish force, responding to the unauthorised English presence with the methodical efficiency of an empire finally taking an irritant seriously, attacked and cleared the island in 1635, killing some of the settlers and driving the rest back to sea. The Spanish then made one of the characteristic mistakes of their Caribbean colonial policy in this period. They cleared the island but did not garrison it. They established a small fort, left a tiny detachment of soldiers, and moved on to other concerns. The endless demands of maintaining an empire whose frontiers were multiplying faster than its administrative capacity could track. Within months of the Spanish withdrawal of their main force, French and English buccaneers were filtering back onto the island. The governor who turned Tortuga from an informal refuge into something approaching a functioning settlement was a Frenchman named Jean Levasseur, who arrived in 1640 with a few hundred settlers under a commission from the Compagnie de Saint-Christophe, a French colonial company with ambitions in the Caribbean that exceeded its resources. Levasseur was an engineer by training, a Protestant by religion. His Huguenot faith would colour his relationship with both the French crown and the Catholic settlers he governed, and a man of sufficient personal intensity and organisational ability to impose a degree of order on a community that was accustomed to operating without any. He immediately set about building what Tortuga had always lacked, and what its strategic situation urgently required: a serious fortification. The fort he built on the island's southern coast, overlooking the harbour, was called La Montagne, the mountain, because he positioned it on a steep rocky elevation that made it approachable only from one direction, and that gave its cannon a commanding field of fire over the harbour approaches and the channel between Tortuga and Hispaniola. The fort was not by European standards enormous, but it was well sited and solidly built, and in the context of Caribbean colonial fortification in the 1640s, it was among the more serious defensive works in the region. Levasseur mounted cannon on its walls and staffed it with a garrison that, supplemented by the broader buccaneer community, gave Tortuga a defensive capability that it had previously lacked entirely. When the Spanish came again, as they did in 1643 and again in 1654, they found an island that was considerably harder to clear than the informal camps they had swept away in previous raids. Levasseur governed Tortuga for about a decade, and his governance was, by the standards of the community he was governing, reasonably effective, and by the standards of any more conventionally organised society, absolutely bizarre. He maintained order through personal authority reinforced by the threat and occasional reality of violence, dispensed justice according to his own judgment, and conducted the island's external relations with a combination of diplomatic independence and commercial pragmatism that the French colonial company that nominally employed him found consistently alarming. He taxed the trade that passed through the harbour, collected a percentage of the prizes brought in by the privateer ships that increasingly used Tortuga as their base, and used the revenue to maintain the fort and pay his small regular garrison. He also, by all accounts, became progressively more eccentric and more tyrannical as his tenure lengthened, developing an absolutism of manner and an unpredictability of behaviour that his Protestant religious community found spiritually troubling, and that his broader population found practically dangerous. He was murdered in 1652 by two of his own associates, and the manner of his death, stabbed by men he had elevated and trusted, was characteristic of the social environment he had spent a decade trying to tame. What Levasseur had created, whatever his personal failings, was a viable settlement. Tortuga by the early 1650s had a harbour that could service and refit ships of moderate size, a fort that could deter casual Spanish raids, a population of several hundred permanent residents supplemented by the fluid community of sailors, hunters, and itinerant merchants who moved through any active Caribbean port, and a commercial economy based on the export of hides and smoked meat, the import of European goods and weapons and rum, and the informal revenues generated by privateering and trade. It was not yet the pirate capital that later decades would make it, but it was the foundation on which that reputation would be built. The transition from buccaneer hunting camp to pirate capital required several things to come together simultaneously. A specific political context in which the European powers found it convenient to tolerate, encourage, or actively organise maritime raiding against each other. A community of mariners with the skills, the ships, and the disposition to conduct that raiding. A base that provided the harbour services and the commercial infrastructure to sustain it. And a set of social codes that allowed a community of men from diverse backgrounds, with no shared nationality or institutional allegiance, to organise themselves into functioning crews and function effectively at sea. Tortuga provided the base. The Buccaneers provided the men. The political context was provided with devastating effectiveness by the increasingly bitter rivalry between Spain and every other European power that wanted a piece of the Caribbean. And the social codes, those extraordinary half-documented, half-legendary arrangements by which the Brotherhood of the Coast organised itself, emerged from the community itself over years of practical necessity into something that historians and political philosophers have found persistently fascinating. The Caribbean of the mid-17th century was a zone of what we might call semi-organised violence, in which the distinction between legitimate warfare and piracy was considerably less clear than the legal categories of the time suggested. The European powers were frequently at war with each other, and when they were at war, issued letters of marque, formal authorisations from the Crown allowing private ship captains to attack the merchant vessels and possessions of enemy nations and keep a portion of what they captured. A captain with a letter of marque was a privateer operating within the legal framework of sanctioned warfare. A captain without one, doing the same thing, was a pirate. The practical difference between the two was the piece of paper, and in the Caribbean, where news of peace treaties signed in Europe might not reach for months, where the political affiliations of ships were not always clear, and where the profits of a successful attack on a Spanish treasure convoy were attractive regardless of the legal niceties, the distinction was often honoured more in the breach than in the observance. The men who made Tortuga their base in the 1650s, 1660s and 1670s operated in this ambiguous legal space with considerable comfort, partly because the ambiguity was useful, and partly because the buccaneer community had developed a set of cultural attitudes towards Spanish authority that made the legal distinctions feel somewhat beside the point. The Spanish had been raiding their settlements, killing their animals, destroying their camps, and enslaved or executed their colleagues for 3 decades. The buccaneer attitude towards Spanish ships and Spanish ports was shaped by this history of conflict and dispossession in ways that gave their raiding a quality that went beyond simple economic opportunism. This was not merely profit-seeking. It was profit-seeking with a grievance, which has a different character and a different intensity. The organisation of a buccaneer or privateer cruise in this period was governed by articles, written agreements drawn up and signed or marked by every member of the crew before departure, that specified the distribution of any prizes taken, the compensation to be paid to men injured in the fighting, the penalties for various types of misconduct, and the basic rules that would govern the ship's operation for the duration of the voyage. The Brotherhood of the Coast, La Côte de la Fraternité in the French usage that appears in the sources, was not merely a romantic label for the buccaneer community. It was a set of specific social obligations and cultural norms that governed relationships within the community, supplementing the formal articles that governed specific cruises with the informal codes that made the community function across multiple voyages and multiple years. Men in the Brotherhood were expected to assist each other in cases of emergency, to share information about Spanish movements and coastal defences, to maintain the collective reputation of the trade by behaving in ways that did not bring the European colonial authorities down on the community as a whole. The codes were enforced through the same reputational mechanisms that enforced the Articles. A man who violated them found his options restricted in the labour market of the Brotherhood, could not find a crew willing to sail with him, and was effectively expelled from the community that was his only viable social world. The specific relationship that Esquemeling describes as matelotage, from the French word for sailor, was a formal bond between two men in the buccaneer community that combined elements of partnership, mutual insurance, and companionship in ways that had no exact equivalent in the social institutions of the European world from which most buccaneers came. Matelos shared their possessions, served on the same ships when possible, were each other's designated heirs in the event of death or incapacitation, and provided each other with the kind of practical and emotional support that family provided in the settled world that most buccaneers had left behind. The relationship has attracted the attention of historians interested in the history of same-sex bonds in the early modern period, and the evidence does suggest that some matelotage relationships included a sexual dimension, though the sources on this are inevitably filtered through the moral categories of their authors and require careful handling. What is clear is that matelotage was a recognised and respected institution within the buccaneer community, providing the social bonds that the mobile, dangerous, familyless life of the Caribbean buccaneer otherwise lacked. Written agreements drawn up and signed or marked by every member of the crew before departure, that specified the distribution of any prizes taken, the compensation to be paid to men injured in the fighting, the penalties for various types of misconduct, and the basic rules that would govern the ship's operation for the duration of the voyage. These articles were not merely aspirational documents. They were enforceable contracts, enforced by the collective authority of the crew, and they represented one of the most democratic institutional arrangements in the 17th century Atlantic world. The captain of a buccaneer vessel was elected by his crew and could be removed by them. His authority at sea was substantial during an engagement, but his authority over the distribution of prizes and the conduct of the crews was constrained by the Articles and by the collective judgment of the men he commanded. The quartermaster, a separate officer elected independently from the captain, managed the distribution of provisions and prizes, served as a counterweight to the captain's authority, and represented the crew's collective interests in disputes about how the ship was being run. This quasi-democratic structure was a practical response to the circumstances of the trade. Men who were willing to risk their lives in the extremely dangerous business of boarding and capturing armed merchant ships, or attacking fortified coastal positions, needed to believe that the risks they ran would be proportionately rewarded and that they would not be cheated of their share by a corrupt or tyrannical captain. The Articles were the mechanism by which that confidence was established, and the reputation of a captain for honouring his Articles and dealing fairly with his crew was his primary capital in the labour market of Tortuga and the other buccaneer ports. Crews were not slaves. They chose their captains. A captain who cheated his crew did not get another crew. The compensation schedules for combat injuries that appear in various buccaneer articles, so many pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, slightly less for a left arm, a specified amount for the loss of a leg or an eye, were a form of workers' compensation that the 17th century land economy provided to almost no one. A farmhand who lost his arm in an accident would receive nothing from his employer and would be left to manage on whatever charity or family support he could find. A buccaneer who lost his arm in a boarding action received a payment specified in advance, in a written contract before the voyage began. The contrast is not flattering to the society that paid the farmhand nothing and called the buccaneer a criminal. Before Morgan, there were others whose careers shaped the Tortuga world he entered, and some of them deserve names rather than the anonymity that the general narrative of buccaneer history assigns to everyone except its most celebrated figure. François l'Olonnais was in many respects the anti-Morgan, a French buccaneer of Basque origin who operated out of Tortuga in the 1660s and whose methods were distinguished by a ferocity so extreme that even the buccaneer community, which was not squeamish, found them notable. His real name was Jean-David No. L'Olonnais was a nickname derived from his hometown of Les Sables d'Olonne on the French Atlantic coast. He had come to the Caribbean as an indentured servant, escaped his indenture, and entered the buccaneer trade with a specific and documented hatred of the Spanish that Esquemeling connects to the brutal treatment he received during a period when he was captured and enslaved by Spanish colonists and only escaped by feigning death among the bodies of men the Spanish had killed. Whether this story is accurate or embellished, it describes the kind of formative experience that the colonial Caribbean was capable of producing in men of certain temperaments, and the operational behaviour it shaped in l'Olonnais was genuinely distinctive in its violence. He raided along the Venezuelan coast in the mid-1660s with considerable success, but it was his campaign against Maracaibo and Gibraltar in 1666, the same cities Morgan would later raid, that produced the detailed account that Esquemeling preserved and that gave l'Olonnais his particular historical notoriety. The interrogation and torture of Spanish prisoners to extract information about the location of valuables was standard practice in Caribbean raiding. L'Olonnais apparently practiced it with a thoroughness and a personal involvement that went beyond the standard, and Esquemeling's account, if accurate, describes acts that the buccaneer tradition itself considered exceptional. He was killed, reportedly by Cuna indigenous people in the Darien region of Panama, while attempting an overland crossing to the Pacific, an ambition that Morgan would pursue successfully a few years later, but that l'Olonnais had neither the organisational ability nor the diplomatic intelligence to manage. His death, in accounts that vary from simple killing to ritual cannibalism depending on the source, was interpreted by those who recorded it with the theological satisfaction that dramatic deaths of notorious sinners tend to attract. Roche Brasiliano was a Dutch buccaneer whose name came from his years in Brazil before the Portuguese expelled the Dutch from that colony in 1654 and scattered its population into the wider Caribbean world. He operated out of Tortuga in the 1660s and was known for a drinking capacity and a personal recklessness that distinguished him even in a community that valued both. He was captured by the Spanish at one point, transported to Spain for trial, and escaped, possibly through the incompetence of his captors, possibly through means that the sources do not record, returning to the Caribbean to continue his career. His raids on the Spanish Main were successful enough to earn him a reputation, but not ambitious enough to create the kind of historical record that Morgan's operations generated, and he fades from the sources in the early 1670s without a clear account of his end. Bartholomew the Portuguese, whose real name is lost and whose sobriquet identifies him only by nationality, which was itself an unusual characteristic in a community where Portuguese were rare, was one of the more colourful figures of the Tortuga period, remarkable primarily for a series of escapes from Spanish captivity that Esquemeling recounts with a relish that suggests they were well-known stories in the buccaneer community. He was captured at least twice, escaped through a combination of improvisation and physical courage on each occasion, and returned each time to the buccaneer trade with the persistence of a man who could not conceive of any other way to live. Whether he died in bed or in battle or in a Spanish prison is not established by the sources, which is itself characteristic of the historical record for most of the people who lived the Tortuga life. The figure who more than any other gave Tortuga its specific historical character, who transformed it from a regional base of Caribbean raiding into a name that resonated across the Atlantic world as a synonym for organised, effective and terrifying piracy, was a Welshman born around 1635 in a village in Monmouthshire, who came to the Caribbean under circumstances that he himself never clearly explained and that the sources do not clarify with any precision. His name was Henry Morgan, and his career was one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Atlantic world, a sequence of military and nautical achievements that would have been remarkable in a man operating with the full resources of a major European state, and that were accomplished instead from the harbour of a small Caribbean island with the most informal of institutional frameworks. How Morgan got to the Caribbean is the first of the mysteries his biography presents. He may have come as an indentured servant, a standard form of labour recruitment in the early Caribbean colonies in which men contracted to work for a fixed period in exchange for their passage across the Atlantic. He may have been transported against his will in the period of political upheaval following the English Civil War, when Cromwell's government dealt with various categories of political inconvenience by sending them to the Caribbean colonies. He may have come as a soldier in the English expedition that captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655. The sources offer different versions, and Morgan himself, in the various legal and political contexts in which his career was later examined, was not forthcoming about his early history. What is clear is that by the late 1650s he was in Jamaica, that he had some experience of Caribbean privateering operations, and that he had the combination of organisational intelligence, physical courage, and personal charisma that was required to rise from the ranks of the Buccaneer community to a position of leadership. Jamaica's capture by the English in 1655 is an event that matters for the Tortuga story because it shifted the centre of gravity of English Caribbean privateering from Tortuga, which had been primarily a French-dominated base, to Jamaica, whose superb natural harbour at Port Royal would eventually rival and then eclipse Tortuga as the most important buccaneer port in the Caribbean. But in the 1650s and early 1660s, Jamaica was still being consolidated as an English colony, and its relationship with Tortuga, with the French colonial establishment there, and with the buccaneer community that used both islands, was complicated by the fact that England and France were simultaneously potential allies against Spain and natural rivals for colonial dominance in the region. Morgan operated in this complex political environment with a facility that suggests either unusual political intelligence or unusual luck, or most likely both. His early raiding career in the late 1650s and early 1660s established him as a capable captain who could organise and lead a cruise, keep his crew together through the organisational difficulties that Caribbean privateering involved, and bring home sufficient prizes to attract men and investment for subsequent ventures. The specific raids of this period are not well documented, partly because the record-keeping of buccaneer operations was understandably sparse, and partly because the political sensitivity of operations conducted in the legally ambiguous zone between legitimate privateering and outright piracy made detailed documentation politically inconvenient. What is clear is that by the mid-1660s, Morgan was a figure of sufficient reputation in the Caribbean to be able to recruit substantial forces for operations that went well beyond the scale of ordinary privateering cruises. The social world of Tortuga and Port Royal in which Morgan moved was unlike anything else in the 17th century Atlantic world. The harbours of these two islands were zones of intense commercial and social activity, places where the proceeds of successful raids were converted with remarkable speed into the goods and pleasures that men who risked their lives for uncertain rewards were inclined to spend lavishly on when the rewards materialised. The taverns that lined the waterfronts of Tortuga and Port Royal, establishments that combined the functions of bar, brothel, gambling house, recruitment centre, and news exchange, were the social infrastructure of the buccaneer world, places where crews were assembled and dissolved, where information about Spanish shipping movements and coastal defences was traded, where arguments were settled, and friendships were formed, and partnerships were struck over cups of rum that was itself a product of the Caribbean sugar economy that the Buccaneers were both parasitic on and partially constitutive of. Rum deserves a moment of attention, because it was genuinely central to the economy and the culture of the buccaneer world. Distilled from the molasses that was a byproduct of Caribbean sugar production, rum was cheap, strong, and available in quantities that the Caribbean sugar colonies produced in enormous volumes as a way of monetising what would otherwise be industrial waste. It became the currency of the lower end of Caribbean commerce. Sailors, buccaneers, dock workers, and servants conducted significant portions of their economic lives in rum rather than in coin, and it was the primary medium through which the brutal economics of the slave-produced sugar plantation intersected with the equally brutal economics of the buccaneer raids that preyed on the shipping, moving that sugar across the Atlantic. The rum trade connected these two worlds in ways that contemporary observers rarely made explicit, and that subsequent historians have only relatively recently begun to map with appropriate care. The women of Tortuga occupy a complicated position in the historical record, which is to say that they are simultaneously present in the documents and absent from the narrative in the way that women in early modern history so often are. The popular image of Tortuga as an exclusively male world of pirates and rum is not quite accurate. The settlement had women from its early decades, though their presence in the records is filtered through the eyes of male observers who are more interested in their physical attributes than in their social roles. The French colonial authorities made deliberate efforts in the 1640s and 1650s to increase the female population of Tortuga by recruiting or in some accounts dispatching women from France, partly because a settlement with more women was considered more stable and more likely to develop into a genuine colony, rather than remaining a transient camp of bachelor hunters and sailors. The women who came, some voluntarily, some under varying degrees of compulsion, occupied a social position shaped by the extreme gender imbalance of the early settlement and by the general lawlessness of an environment where formal legal protection was minimal. Some established households, some operated taverns or small commercial enterprises, some found their circumstances considerably less than they had been led to expect. The historical record does not give most of them names. Morgan's first major operation that demonstrated the full scope of his ambitions and abilities was the sack of Puerto Príncipe, modern Camagüey in Cuba, in 1668, conducted with a force of roughly 700 men assembled from the buccaneer communities of Tortuga and Jamaica. The raid was authorised by the governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, under a commission that stretched the definition of legitimate privateering to its absolute limit, but that provided the legal cover Morgan needed to operate with official English sanction, rather than as an outright pirate. The sack of Puerto Príncipe produced less plunder than Morgan had promised his investors and his crew. The Spanish had warning enough to hide much of their valuables before the Buccaneers arrived, and the discontent it generated in his force required him to immediately propose a more ambitious target to hold his coalition together. The target he proposed was Portobello. This was not the decision of a man who thought small. Portobello was one of the most fortified cities on the Spanish Main, the term used for the Spanish-controlled Caribbean coast of Central and South America, and was the Atlantic terminal of the route by which the silver of Peru reached Spain. Every year the silver fleet assembled there to make the crossing to Seville, and the fortifications built to protect that assembly point were among the most substantial in the Spanish colonial world. 3 separate forts guarded the harbour approaches. The garrison was substantial. The walls were stone. The artillery was real. Any competent military planner looking at Portobello in 1668 would have said that attacking it with 700 buccaneers in small vessels was somewhere between extremely dangerous and suicidal. Morgan attacked it anyway. The assault on Portobello in July 1668 was conducted with the tactical intelligence and the sheer violent energy that characterised Morgan's best operations. He approached by night in small boats, landed before dawn, and attacked the first fort before the garrison was fully alert. The second fort was assaulted with a calculated brutality that has remained controversial ever since. Morgan used Spanish prisoners, priests among them, as human shields in the advance on the walls, placing them at the front of his attacking columns in the explicit knowledge that the garrison would find it politically and morally difficult to fire on their own people. Whether the garrison fired anyway, causing casualties among the prisoners, or held their fire, making the assault easier, the sources give different accounts. The fort fell. The city was taken. The third fort surrendered after negotiation. What Morgan extracted from Portobello in the days that followed the assault was, by Caribbean standards, a spectacular haul. 250,000 pieces of 8 in ransom and plunder. According to his own accounting, which was probably subject to the same optimistic inflation that privateers routinely applied to their prize reports. The city was held for ransom rather than simply plundered and burned, a tactical preference that Morgan maintained throughout his career. A city that was ransomed rather than destroyed could be ransomed again, and the negotiations involved in extracting the ransom gave Morgan a period of time in which to secure the harbour and prepare for the Spanish counterattack that he knew would eventually come. He extracted his forces before that counterattack materialised, returning to Jamaica with the prizes and the reputation that Portobello had generated. The reputation was enormous and immediate. News of the sack of Portobello spread through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic with the speed that genuinely extraordinary events travel in any communication system, even one as slow as the 17th centuries. The Spanish colonial administration was furious and alarmed. The governor of Panama complained to the governor of Jamaica, who replied with the bland diplomatic dishonesty of a colonial official who needed both the protection that Morgan's forces provided against Spanish aggression and the ability to deny any official responsibility for what those forces did. In England, where the political relationship with Spain was always complicated by the balance between commercial rivalry and dynastic alliance, the Portobello raid was received with a mixture of private admiration and public disavowal. Morgan was what England needed in the Caribbean, and what it could not officially claim. Before we follow Morgan to Panama, to the most audacious operation of his career, and one of the most audacious in the history of Caribbean raiding, it is worth understanding the man himself more fully, because he is one of those historical figures whose actual complexity is consistently flattened by the legend that surrounds him. The Morgan of popular imagination is a swaggering rogue, a romantic criminal operating outside the constraints of civilization for the sheer joy of the thing. The Morgan of the historical record is something more interesting and more unsettling. A very intelligent, very ambitious man of working-class origins who used the specific institutions and opportunities of the buccaneer world to build a career that the social structure of 17th century England would otherwise have made impossible for someone of his background, and who navigated the transition from buccaneer captain to colonial official with a political adroitness that suggests he understood throughout his career that the pirate life was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The social world he rose from was not romantic. The Caribbean colonies of the mid-17th century were brutal places by most measures. The heat, the disease environment, the subsistence conditions of the early settlements, the casual violence of a society with minimal legal infrastructure, and extremely low expectations about how long any given person was likely to live. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and the various other tropical illnesses that Europeans encountered in the Caribbean killed immigrants at rates that made the Atlantic crossing a genuinely risky investment of one's person. The average life expectancy in the early Caribbean settlements was short enough that the colonies would not have maintained their populations without continuous immigration, and much of that immigration was involuntary. Indentured servants, transported criminals, prisoners of various kinds, supplemented by the enslaved Africans whose forced migration was already beginning to define the Caribbean's demographic future. The men who became buccaneers were in most cases men who had run out of better alternatives, and the Brotherhood of the Coast, for all its internal democracy, was built on the desperation that created it. He consolidated his position through the late 1660s, using Tortuga and Jamaica simultaneously as bases, conducting smaller operations against Spanish coastal settlements and shipping, and building the reputation that was his primary recruiting tool. The buccaneer labour market was, as we have noted, competitive and discerning. Men chose their captains carefully, and a captain who had sacked Portobello had demonstrated a combination of courage, tactical intelligence, and willingness to share the proceeds that was attractive to exactly the kind of men who were available for the next large operation. When Morgan began recruiting for his most ambitious enterprise yet, he had no difficulty attracting numbers that surprised even himself. The raid on Maracaibo in 1669 was the intermediate step. A large-scale operation against a Venezuelan city that required navigating a treacherous sandbar-filled lagoon, defeating a Spanish squadron on the way out, and extracting a substantial ransom before the Spanish fleet could close the trap. Morgan managed all of this with the combination of tactical innovation and personal nerve that had characterized Portobello. He defeated the Spanish squadron partly by the use of a fire ship, a vessel packed with combustibles, and sailed into the Spanish formation before being abandoned, setting one of the Spanish galleons ablaze and throwing the squadron's formation into chaos. The episode demonstrated that Morgan was not merely a raider of poorly defended shore positions, but a commander capable of naval engagement against organised opposition. The operation that defined Morgan's career, and that gave Tortuga its most lasting claim to historical distinction, was the assault on Panama City in 1671. But before we follow the fleet out of Tortuga harbour on that December morning in 1670, it is worth pausing to understand what was being assembled and what the men in those 36 ships were thinking and expecting. They were not uniformly desperate men with nothing to lose. The buccaneer fleet Morgan assembled included experienced mariners with multiple successful cruises behind them, men who had survived previous operations and retained enough prize money to choose their next captain carefully. It included French filibusters who had their own tradition of Caribbean raiding and their own sense of professional standards. It included a substantial number of men who were, by the social standards of the 17th century Atlantic world, doing reasonably well for themselves, and who were joining the operation because the potential return was extraordinary, rather than because they had no other options. The assembly at Tortuga in December 1670, ships arriving from Jamaica and from various points along the Caribbean coast, men signing the articles and marking their names or their marks beside their agreed shares, captains meeting with Morgan to coordinate the operational plan, was the largest single gathering of buccaneer force in the history of Caribbean raiding. The logistics of feeding 2,000 men and maintaining 36 ships in a single anchorage for the weeks of preparation required before departure were themselves a demonstration of the organisational capability that Morgan had developed across a decade of increasingly complex operations. Tortuga's harbour, which had always been functional rather than spectacular, was by 1670 sufficiently developed to manage this scale of operation. It had warehouses for supplies, facilities for repairing and refitting ships, and the commercial infrastructure of a small colonial town that had been dealing with the needs of privateering fleets for 3 decades. It was, by any measure, the largest and most ambitious buccaneer operation in the history of Caribbean raiding, and it was conducted under circumstances that were, even by the standards of the buccaneer world, legally extraordinary. England and Spain had signed a peace treaty in 1670, the Treaty of Madrid, which included provisions for the cessation of privateering activities against Spanish possessions. Morgan was almost certainly aware of this treaty when he assembled his force. He proceeded with the operation anyway, partly because the treaty had not yet been formally communicated to the Caribbean colonies, partly because the governor of Jamaica, Modiford, seems to have encouraged him to proceed on the grounds that Spanish provocations in the Caribbean provided sufficient justification, and partly because the target was too attractive and the force already assembled was too large and too expensive to redirect, without the kind of organisational crisis that could have ended his career. The force Morgan assembled at Tortuga in late 1670 was the largest buccaneer fleet ever assembled. 36 ships and approximately 2,000 men, drawn from the buccaneer communities of Tortuga and Jamaica, and supplemented by French filibusters, the French Caribbean equivalent of the English buccaneers, a word derived from the Dutch vrijbuiter, freebooter, which also gave the English the word filibuster, one of history's more improbable etymological journeys, who saw in Morgan's operation an opportunity for profit that transcended the usual national distinctions. This was a genuinely multinational force, commanded by a Welshman operating under an English commission, assembled at a French-dominated base, crewed by men from 6 European nationalities, and aimed at a Spanish city on the Pacific coast of Central America. The route to Panama City required crossing the Isthmus of Panama, then as now one of the most hostile jungle environments in the Americas. Morgan's force crossed the Chagres River by boat and then proceeded overland through jungle, swamp and Spanish ambush for 9 days before reaching the interior. The crossing was brutal. The men ran out of food almost immediately, a miscalculation of supplies that was characteristic of large, rapidly assembled expeditions, and that the jungle provided no means of remedying, except through the occasional capture of Spanish livestock and the consumption of increasingly desperate alternatives. The accounts of men eating leather satchels, boiling tobacco bags for the nutritional value of whatever residue remained in them, cutting grass and swallowing it unchewed, have the quality of experiences that were too real to have been invented. By the time Morgan's force emerged from the jungle onto the Pacific Coast Plain, they were in poor condition physically, and in the furious, desperate, emotional state of men who had endured extraordinary hardship and needed it to be worth something. The Battle of Panama was not a close contest. The Spanish force that met Morgan's advance on the outskirts of the city had numerical advantages and the benefit of defending their home territory, but they had not faced opponents of Morgan's experience and collective ferocity and the disciplined violence of the Buccaneer advance, each man fighting for his individual share of the prize that the city represented, overcame the Spanish defensive organization within a few hours of hard fighting. Panama City was the richest city in Spanish Central America, the entrepot through which the silver of Peru passed on its way to the Atlantic crossing. What it contained was what Morgan had crossed the isthmus for. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. The city burned. The question of whether Morgan ordered it burned, whether the Spanish burned it themselves to prevent its contents from being captured, or whether the fire was an accident that the chaos of an occupied city in the immediate aftermath of battle made unpredictable. This question has been argued over ever since. Panama City was in any case destroyed, and a new Panama City was built on a different site after Morgan's force had left. The ruins of the original city still exist on the Pacific coast of modern Panama, Old Panama, Panama Viejo, visible enough that UNESCO has designated them a World Heritage Site, and distinctive enough that a visitor standing among the remains of the old cathedral tower on the seafront can look out across the water and understand in a physical way what was here and what was taken. The proceeds of the Panama operation were, by Morgan's own accounting, and by the general consensus of the men who participated in it, deeply disappointing. The enormous wealth that Panama City was supposed to contain was not found in the burned ruins. The Spanish had moved it. They had had just enough warning of the approaching force to send the bulk of the city's most valuable movable assets out by sea before Morgan's force arrived. And what remained after the fire was a fraction of what had been there. The distribution to Morgan's 2,000 men amounted to a fraction of what the crossing had cost them in suffering and risk. The French filibusters who had joined the expedition on the expectation of substantial returns were furious. There were accusations that Morgan had hidden the true extent of the plunder and cheated his men of their rightful shares, accusations that followed him home to Jamaica and that his enemies used in the political storm that the raid generated. The political storm was considerable, because the Panama raid had been conducted after the signing of the Treaty of Madrid, and Spain's protests were loud, specific, and diplomatically inconvenient. The English government, trying to maintain the peace that the treaty represented while managing the Caribbean situation that Morgan's activities had complicated, did what governments in diplomatically awkward situations with genuinely useful military assets tend to do. It staged a public gesture of accountability while protecting the asset in question. Morgan was arrested, transported to England, held for 2 years in conditions of remarkable comfort for a man technically under arrest, examined by the Privy Council, and then, in 1674, given a knighthood and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. He returned to the Caribbean as a colonial official, spent his later years in Jamaica alternately hunting down pirates, which required a creative relationship with his own past, drinking heavily and managing his estates. He died in 1688 of what contemporaries described as dropsy, and what modern medical interpretation suggests was probably liver failure, which is the Caribbean colonial version of dying peacefully in bed. The world in which Morgan had operated was already changing significantly by the time of his death, and the changes would transform Tortuga and the broader buccaneer culture in ways that the men of the 1660s and 1670s had not anticipated and would not have welcomed. The political calculus of the Caribbean was shifting. The major European powers, England, France, the Netherlands, were increasingly interested in the regularization of Caribbean commerce rather than in the disruption of Spanish commerce through privateering. Sugar had become the dominant economic logic of the Caribbean, and the sugar economy required stable trade routes, reliable labour supplies, and the kind of institutional order that the buccaneer presence complicated. A Caribbean that was too dangerous for merchant shipping was a Caribbean that could not efficiently export sugar, and the profits of sugar, once they became fully apparent in the 1660s and 1670s, were orders of magnitude larger than the profits of privateering. The colonial governments that had found the buccaneers useful against Spain increasingly found them an obstacle to the commercial development they were trying to promote. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670, which England and Spain had signed and which had been so awkwardly violated by the Panama Raid, committed England to suppressing privateering against Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. Similar treaties among the other European powers steadily narrowed the legal space within which privateer commissions could be issued. The men who had been buccaneers with commissions, technically legal if always ambiguous, found those commissions increasingly difficult to obtain, and the work they had been doing under those commissions increasingly liable to prosecution as simple piracy. The transition from privateer to pirate was not a change in what the men did. It was a change in the political context that determined whether what they did was sanctioned or criminal. The same action that had made Morgan a knight made other men into defendants at the Admiralty Court. Tortuga's specific story in this period reflects the broader transformation. The French colonial authorities, who had been playing a careful game with the buccaneer community throughout the middle decades of the century, tolerating and sometimes encouraging their activities against Spain, while trying to develop the French colonial presence in the Caribbean into something more stable and profitable, made a series of decisions in the 1660s and 1670s that gradually tightened control over the island and shifted its economic basis toward plantation agriculture. The key figure in this transition was Bertrand d'Ogeron, who arrived as the French governor of Tortuga in 1665 and who spent the next decade trying to transform the buccaneer base into a proper colony. D'Ogeron was a man of considerable practical intelligence and genuine administrative ability, and he understood both the value of the buccaneer community and the limitations it placed on Tortuga's development as a sustainable colony. His approach was characteristically French in its combination of idealism and pragmatism. He encouraged the planting of tobacco and later sugarcane, alongside the continued buccaneer activity, tried to improve the island's gender balance by importing women from France, developed the infrastructure of the harbour settlement, and maintained relationships with the buccaneer captains that kept them nominally attached to French interests, without eliminating the independence that made them useful. He also expanded French colonial activity to the western part of Hispaniola itself, the region that would eventually become Saint-Domingue and later Haiti, establishing the plantation economy there that would make Saint-Domingue one of the richest colonies in the world by the 18th century, and would eventually produce the Haitian Revolution, one of the most consequential events in the history of the Atlantic world. The transformation of Western Hispaniola into a sugar plantation economy based on enslaved African labour was the larger story within which Tortuga's decline as a buccaneer base occurred, and that larger story requires some direct attention because it is too significant to treat merely as backdrop. The sugar revolution in the Caribbean, the rapid transformation of the islands from mixed economy colonial settlements into monoculture plantation economies, producing sugar for European markets, was one of the most consequential economic and demographic events in the history of the Atlantic world, and it occurred in the same decades as the peak of the buccaneer era, overlapping and intertwining with it in ways that the swashbuckling narrative consistently underplays. Sugar had been cultivated in the Caribbean since the early Spanish colonial period, but it was the English colonisation of Barbados in the 1620s and 1630s, followed by the adoption of the large-scale plantation model with enslaved African labour in the 1640s, that produced the explosive growth of sugar production that transformed the Caribbean's economic logic. By the 1660s and 1670s, the sugar produced in Barbados, Jamaica and the French islands was generating profits that dwarfed anything the Buccaneer raids could produce, and the organisational and political energy of the European colonial powers was shifting accordingly, away from the encouragement of privateering against Spanish commerce and toward the protection of their own sugar-producing colonies and the slave trade that supplied them. The enslaved Africans who worked the sugar plantations of the Caribbean in the second half of the 17th century outnumbered the free population of the islands by ratios that grew more extreme with each decade. The African slave trade, which had been a relatively modest operation in the early Caribbean colonial period, expanded dramatically in response to the labour demands of the sugar economy. The Royal African Company, chartered in England in 1660, held a monopoly on the English slave trade and supplied the plantation colonies of Jamaica, Barbados and the Leeward Islands with enslaved people transported from West Africa in conditions of deliberate brutality that the company's own records document with a clinical precision that the modern reader finds difficult to process. The French equivalent, the Compagnie du Sénégal, performed the same function for the French colonies. The human cost of the sugar economy, in the Middle Passage, in the plantation conditions that killed enslaved people at rates high enough to require continuous replacement from new imports, in the systematic destruction of African social and cultural identity that the plantation system required, was enormous beyond easy quantification, and was understood at the time by those who chose to understand it. The buccaneer world was not separate from this economy, it was embedded in it. The rum that funded the tavern culture of Tortuga and Port Royal was a product of the sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. The provisions that supplied buccaneer cruises were produced in part by the same plantation agriculture. The harbours that the buccaneers used were ports and colonial settlements whose existence depended on the slave trade. And the buccaneers themselves, in their raiding of Spanish possessions, sometimes captured and sometimes freed enslaved people, sometimes both in the same operation, keeping some and releasing others according to calculations that reflected the same moral incoherence about slavery that characterized the entire European Atlantic world of the period. And the two were not unrelated. The same French colonial policy that was encouraging plantation development was also trying to discipline the buccaneer community into a more regularized form of colonial service. The flibustiers, the French filibusters, were channeled into official privateering when France was at war with Spain, which was frequently, and were pressured toward more conventional colonial activities when France was at peace. Tortuga's importance as an independent buccaneer base diminished as Jamaica's Port Royal, with its better harbour and its richer English colonial hinterland, became the dominant centre of Caribbean privateering in the 1670s. The action, such as it was moving elsewhere. Port Royal at its height in the 1670s and early 1680s was a more spectacular version of what Tortuga had been in its heyday. Denser, richer, louder, more thoroughly committed to the proposition that the proceeds of maritime violence should be spent as quickly and as completely as possible. The town that grew on the spit of land forming the southern side of Kingston Harbour was packed with taverns, brothels, warehouses and merchant houses in a density that contemporaries found alarming and that subsequent visitors found irresistible material for vivid description. The social rituals of prize distribution were as important as the fighting itself in defining the buccaneer world's character, and they deserve more than passing mention. When a buccaneer vessel returned to port with prizes, the process of accounting and distribution that followed was governed by the articles and overseen by the quartermaster, who served as the crew's advocate in any dispute about the assessment of the prize's value or the allocation of shares. The captain received a larger share than ordinary crew members, typically 2 to 3 times the ordinary share, reflecting his leadership role and the responsibility he had assumed for the success of the operation. but not the enormous disparities of wealth and compensation that characterise the hierarchical world of conventional naval service, where captains and admirals received portions that could be hundreds of times the allocation of ordinary seamen. The buccaneer model was more compressed, more egalitarian, more explicitly contractual. Every man knew before the cruise what his share would be if the cruise succeeded. Every man had agreed to the terms. Every man had recourse to the collective judgment of the crew if he believed the terms were not being honoured. The speed with which prize money was spent in the taverns and brothels of Tortuga and Port Royal was a phenomenon that contemporaries observed with a mixture of moral disapproval and practical understanding. Esquemeling noted it. Exquemelin, the variant spelling of his name that the French edition used, described buccaneers arriving in port with thousands of pieces of eight and departing broke within days, having spent every penny on drink, gambling, and the company of women before signing on for another cruise that would repeat the cycle. This pattern was not mere moral failure, though contemporaries framed it in those terms. It was a rational response to a specific economic situation. A buccaneer who hoarded his prize money faced the risk that the money would be lost or stolen or taxed away before he could spend it. He had no property to invest in, no legal status to protect, no social infrastructure of family and community that wealth could improve. What he had was the present, and the present was best enjoyed in the present. The philosophy of spending everything immediately was not irrational, given the life expectancy and the social circumstances of the men doing the spending. John Esquemeling, the Dutch buccaneer who wrote the most detailed contemporary account of the buccaneer world, The Buccaneers of America, published in 1678, which is the source through which most of what the modern world knows about this period and these people has been filtered, described Port Royal as one of the wickedest cities in the world, a judgment he delivered with the particular relish of a man who was simultaneously condemning and celebrating what he described. His book was an immediate bestseller in Dutch, French, English and Spanish translation, which tells you something about the appetite of 17th century readers for exactly this combination of violence, adventure and moral disapproval. Esquemeling himself had been a buccaneer. He had participated in Morgan's Panama raid, which is how he knew about it in the detail he recorded, and his account, while partisan in some respects and embellished in others, provides the closest thing we have to an insider view of the buccaneer community's daily life and professional practice. He describes the articles that governed buccaneer cruises in detail. He describes the wounds and the combat and the prize-taking and the distribution of plunder. He describes the rapid consumption of prize money in the taverns of Tortuga and Port Royal, the legendary tendency of buccaneers to spend everything they made in the same harbour that they had been paid in, setting themselves up for the necessity of another cruise with the same mathematical certainty that gamblers set themselves up for the necessity of another bet. He describes Morgan with an ambivalence that reflects both genuine admiration for his military abilities and considerable bitterness about the Panama prize distribution, and his account of Morgan was the source of a libel suit that Morgan filed against the English publishers of the translated edition, which is one of the more remarkable episodes in 17th century publishing history, a pirate suing for defamation. The earthquake that destroyed Port Royal on June 7, 1692 was one of the most dramatic single events in Caribbean colonial history. The town, built on the unstable sand and gravel of a reclaimed spit, liquefied in the earthquake's shaking and slid in large sections into the harbour. Approximately 2,000 people died in the initial disaster, and another 2,000 from the disease and disorder of the aftermath. The town was rebuilt more modestly, on slightly higher ground, and Kingston, across the harbour, eventually absorbed most of Port Royal's commercial functions. The earthquake was interpreted by contemporaries with the theological enthusiasm that the 17th century brought to dramatic natural events as divine judgment on a city that had so conspicuously exemplified everything the Puritan moral tradition found objectionable. It may or may not have been divine judgment. It was certainly a geological event with political consequences, removing at a stroke the physical infrastructure that had sustained the English Caribbean buccaneer world. Tortuga had already been declining as a primary buccaneer base before Port Royal's destruction. The French colonial administration's increasing control over the island, the shift of economic emphasis toward plantation agriculture in western Hispaniola, the narrowing legal space for legitimate privateering, and the growing effectiveness of European naval patrols in suppressing outright piracy had all been working in combination to transform the island from the centre of Caribbean raiding into a progressively more conventional colonial settlement. The harbour that had sheltered Henry Morgan's fleet and Jean Levasseur's garrison was increasingly the harbour of farmers and merchants rather than of buccaneers, and the distinction mattered because without the particular political and economic conditions that had sustained the buccaneer world, there was nothing especially remarkable about a small French colonial island with a decent harbour on the northern coast of Hispaniola. The transformation was not instantaneous. The 1680s and 1690s were the period of the last great flowering of Caribbean piracy, in which men who could no longer operate from Tortuga or Port Royal under any pretense of legal authorization moved their operations to the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the waters around Madagascar, the period that produced the legends of Captain Kidd and of the pirate colony of Libertalia, and that generated the legal and naval response from the major European powers that definitively ended the buccaneering era by the early 18th century. The golden age of piracy, as historians now call the period roughly from 1690 to 1730, was largely conducted not from Tortuga, but from Nassau in the Bahamas, and from the waters of the Indian Ocean, which had replaced the Caribbean as the zone of relative lawlessness where maritime predation could be conducted at scale. Tortuga's moment was specific to the mid-17th century, to a particular political window that opened and closed within about 50 years, and that produced, within those 50 years, more drama, more colour, more violence, and more genuinely extraordinary human stories than most places accumulate in centuries. The mythology of Tortuga and the Buccaneers has proven considerably more durable than the historical reality, and a brief excursion into the generation that came after, the Golden Age pirates of the early 18th century who carried the buccaneer tradition into its final and most famous chapter, helps clarify what was distinctive about Tortuga's specific moment and what distinguished the buccaneer era from what followed it. The pirates who operated out of Nassau in the Bahamas in the years between roughly 1714 and 1725, the period immediately following the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, when thousands of former privateers found themselves without commissions, without employment, and with well-developed skills in maritime violence, were in many respects the heirs of the Tortuga tradition. They flew variations of the Black Flag, they operated under articles, they elected their captains, they distributed prizes according to agreed formulas, but they were operating in a different political context and with a different self-understanding that gave the final phase of Caribbean piracy a distinct character. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was by common consent the most theatrical pirate in history, a man who understood that reputation was as valuable as firepower, and who cultivated his terrifying image with a deliberateness that makes him seem, in retrospect, more like a modern celebrity than a 17th century buccaneer. The slow-burning hemp cords he wove into his enormous black beard, lit before battle so that smoke wreathed his face in the manner of a figure from hell. This was not an accident or a practical measure. It was a brand as carefully constructed as any modern marketing campaign, designed to produce the specific psychological effect of absolute terror in the crews of vessels he approached. It worked. His reputation preceded his ships into harbours and produced surrenders that saved him the trouble and the risk of actual fighting. He was killed in a naval engagement off North Carolina in November 1718, his body reportedly floating around the ship several times before sinking after being shot multiple times and nearly decapitated, a death so dramatically excessive that it seems like the ocean was making a point. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were the most celebrated of the women who participated directly in the Golden Age piracy as fighters, rather than merely as residents of pirate ports. They sailed together on the ship of John Rackham, Calico Jack, so named for his preference for calico cloth, and were, by the testimony of their trial, the most ferocious fighters on a vessel whose male crew was, when the Jamaican authorities caught them in 1720, too drunk to mount serious resistance. Both women were convicted of piracy. Both were reprieved from hanging on the grounds of pregnancy. Mary Read died in prison from fever before she could be released. Anne Bonny's fate after her reprieve is not established by the historical record. She disappears from the sources, which may mean she died in prison, was released and returned to obscurity, or managed some other arrangement that the record does not preserve. The uncertainty is itself characteristic of a historical record that tracks famous men through their deaths, and loses track of women once they are no longer convenient subjects for male attention. The mythology of Tortuga and the Buccaneers has proven considerably more durable than the historical reality, and the relationship between the two is worth examining, because the mythology has shaped everything from swashbuckling adventure novels to the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise in ways that have obscured some genuinely interesting truths about what the Buccaneer world actually was. The pirate of popular imagination, the eye patch, the parrot, the skull and crossbones flag, the treasure buried on desert islands, is a composite construction that drew on the real Buccaneer tradition, but overlaid it with narrative elements from various sources. The adventure fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries, the theatrical tradition of pirate characters that flourished in the same period, and the particular romanticism that the Victorian era applied to anything it could position as vigorous, masculine, and pre-modern. Some of these elements have more historical basis than others. The Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones flag, did exist, though it seems to have been developed in the early 18th century rather than in the height of the Tortuga period, and different pirate captains flew different variations of it. The eye patch seems to be more fiction than history. The parrot is plausible in the sense that the Caribbean was genuinely full of parrots that were genuinely traded as exotic pets across the Atlantic. Parrots were a documented item of Caribbean commerce in the 17th century, but the specific association of pirates with parrots appears to come primarily from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which was published in 1883 and which, along with Daniel Defoe's earlier fictions, did more to shape the popular image of the Golden Age pirate than any historical source. What the mythology consistently misses, or deliberately excises, is the labour dimension of the Buccaneer world. The Buccaneers operated in a Caribbean economy whose wealth was produced primarily by enslaved Africans working on sugar plantations, and the relationship between the Buccaneer community and the slave trade and the slave economy was not the clean separation that the adventure narrative implies. Buccaneers raided Spanish settlements, and in doing so sometimes freed enslaved people, and sometimes captured them. They sailed on ships that were crewed by free black sailors alongside white ones. The Buccaneer articles that governed prize distribution did not always specify racial distinctions, though the practice was inconsistent and the evidence is fragmentary. They operated from islands whose plantation economies, developing in parallel with the Buccaneer culture, were built on enslaved labour. The moral simplicity of the pirate freedom narrative is complicated by the social realities of the world in which that freedom was exercised, and recent historical scholarship has been working to make those complications visible in ways that earlier generations of historians preferred to avoid. There were black buccaneers and black pirates throughout this period, and their presence in the historical record has been systematically underrepresented by sources that reflected the racial categories of the societies doing the documenting, and by historians who worked from those sources without adequately interrogating their silences. Diego el Mulato, a Spanish-speaking mixed-race pirate who operated out of Tortuga, and the Yucatan in the 1630s, raided Spanish coastal settlements with sufficient effectiveness to be mentioned in multiple colonial records. Black Caesar, who operated in the Straits of Florida in the early 18th century, is one of the more documented examples of black piracy in the Caribbean tradition. Abraham Samuel, who led a pirate community in Madagascar in the 1690s, had been born enslaved in the Caribbean before escaping and making his way to the Indian Ocean through the specific freedom that maritime piracy, at its most idealistic, occasionally actually provided. These figures are not peripheral to the Buccaneer story. They are part of it, and their presence complicates in productive ways the freedom narrative that the mythology has always preferred to keep clean. The Buccaneer articles themselves, the democratic contracts that governed crew relationships, have attracted the attention of political theorists as well as historians because they represent an unusually clear empirical case of a self-governing community organising itself outside any existing state framework and producing, through collective necessity, institutional arrangements that functioned effectively enough to sustain complex coordinated action over extended periods. Peter Leeson, an economist who wrote a careful analysis of pirate governance, characterised the Buccaneer Articles as an example of private constitutional governance. The specification of the basic rules of the enterprise by the members of the enterprise themselves, enforced through collective action, and the reputational mechanisms that the labour market for pirate crews provided. This is probably giving the Buccaneers more institutional credit than they would have recognised or claimed. They were not political philosophers. They were working sailors trying to solve the practical problems of organising dangerous collective enterprises. But the analysis is not wrong, and it reflects the genuine historical interest of institutions that produced democratic governance in the 17th century, not through ideological commitment, but through practical necessity. The island of Tortuga today is part of the Republic of Haiti, but the path from the pirate capital of the 17th century to the Haitian Republic of the 21st runs through one of the most important events in the history of the Atlantic world, and it is worth pausing on that path before we arrive at the present. Saint-Domingue, the French colony that d'Ogeron had begun developing in western Hispaniola in the 1660s and 1670s, using Tortuga as its administrative base before the colony's centre of gravity shifted to the larger island, became by the mid-18th century the most profitable colony in the entire Atlantic world. It produced approximately half of the sugar and half of the coffee consumed in Europe, generated revenues that made it more valuable to France than all of French Canada and the French territories in continental North America combined, and did all of this through the labour of an enslaved population that by the 1780s numbered approximately 500,000 people, roughly 15 times the free population of the colony. The conditions in which that enslaved population lived and worked were among the most brutal in the Atlantic slave system, a system that was not distinguished by its gentleness anywhere. The mortality rate on the Saint-Domingue sugar plantations was high enough that the enslaved population could not reproduce itself and required constant importation from Africa to maintain its numbers, a demographic indicator whose implications are not difficult to grasp. The Haitian Revolution that began in 1791 was the largest and most successful slave uprising in the history of the Atlantic world, and it produced, after 13 years of extraordinary violence and political complexity, the Republic of Haiti, the first black republic in history, the second republic in the Western Hemisphere, and the first nation to be founded as an explicit rejection of the institution of slavery. The revolution was the product of Saint-Domingue's specific social structure, which had created not only the enormous enslaved majority, but also a significant population of free people of colour, a franchise, who occupied an intermediate social position, owning property and sometimes even enslaved people themselves, but denied the full political rights of white colonists. The initial revolt in 1791 involved all three groups of the colony's population at various points and in varying configurations, producing 13 years of warfare against French, Spanish, British, and eventually Napoleonic forces before Haitian independence was declared on January 1st, 1804, under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The island of Tortuga today is part of the Republic of Haiti, which it has been in one administrative form or another since the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 transformed Saint-Domingue from the wealthiest colony in the Atlantic world into the first successful slave revolution in the history of the Americas. The island's formal name in Haitian Creole is La Tortue, maintaining the turtle etymology through the linguistic transformation from French colonial to Haitian independence. It has a population of approximately 30,000 people, several small towns, a ferry connection to the Haitian mainland across the channel that Jean Levasseur's cannon once commanded, and the remains of the fort that Levasseur built in 1640, La Montagne, now called Fort de Rocher, eroded and overgrown but recognisable still in its hilltop position, its cannon long since removed. The harbour that Morgan's fleet filled in 1670 is a harbour for fishing boats now, and the fishermen who go out in the morning through the channel where French filibusters and English buccaneers once jostled for anchorage are not thinking about Henry Morgan or Jean Levasseur, or the extraordinary 50 years that gave their island a name that resonated across the Atlantic world for centuries. They are thinking about fish, which is appropriate. The island was there before the Buccaneers, and it is there after them, and the deep history of a place is always larger than any particular episode in it, however dramatic that episode was. What is remarkable is how specifically that particular episode was shaped by geography and accident and political contingency. How many things had to be simultaneously true for Tortuga to be Tortuga? The Spanish had to have cleared the indigenous population without fully settling the island. The wild pigs had to have bred successfully enough to attract hunters. The hunters had to have developed the boucan technique from indigenous knowledge. The European powers had to have been simultaneously ambitious enough to want the Caribbean and weak enough in the region to need the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers had to have developed the articles and the democratic crew culture that made large-scale operations possible. The specific political window between the 1640s and the 1680s, in which the letters of marque were available enough to provide legal cover, and the European navies were thin enough to provide inadequate enforcement, had to have been open for exactly the right number of years. Any one of these conditions could have been different, and the story would have been different. That they were all simultaneously true, in exactly the right sequence, is one of those historical coincidences that produces not just events, but a specific and irreplaceable atmosphere. The atmosphere of Tortuga in its heyday, the smell of tar and rum and smoked meat, the sound of a dozen languages in the harbour, the sight of weathered sails being repaired on the waterfront while men with improbable life histories drank and argued and made plans, is gone, as all atmospheres eventually go. But it was real. The men who lived in it were real. The ships that rode at anchor in the harbour were real. The violence was real, and so was the freedom, qualified and complicated and built on other people's suffering as that freedom always was. The historical record is real, and the island is still there, still shaped like a turtle in profile from the sea, still rising above the channel between itself and Hispaniola, where the trades push their steady breath across the water in all seasons. The story of Tortuga is not only a story about pirates, though the pirates give it its most immediately gripping episodes. It is a story about what happens in the spaces that empires leave ungoverned, the gaps between the formal claims of sovereignty and the practical capacity to enforce them, the zones where ordinary political rules stop applying and human communities improvise new ones from the materials at hand. To understand why Tortuga mattered, why the Atlantic world's most powerful empire spent decades trying and failing to suppress a small island of hunters and mariners, you have to understand what the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean actually was and what it was protecting. The floater system, the convoy of ships that annually carried the silver of the Americas across the Atlantic to Seville, was the economic heartbeat of the Spanish imperial project and one of the most valuable and most visible targets in the history of maritime commerce. Twice a year, enormous convoys assembled in the Caribbean, one at Veracruz in Mexico, collecting the silver of New Spain, and one at Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama, collecting the silver of Peru that had crossed the Pacific in the Manila galleons and then the Isthmus overland, and then sailed together to Havana, where they merged and made the Atlantic crossing under naval escort to Cadiz. The scale of this operation was staggering. In its peak decades, the flotta carried silver in quantities that made it the single most valuable regular commercial operation in the world. The silver mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico were producing in the 16th and early 17th centuries at rates that had no precedent in the history of precious metal extraction, and the majority of that production flowed east across the Atlantic into the European economy, fueling an inflation that historians have called the price revolution, and that transformed the economic landscape of Europe as thoroughly as the bubonic plague had transformed its demographic one. Silver from Potosi circulated in Chinese markets. Silver from Mexico paid for the wars of the Spanish Habsburgs in the Netherlands and Germany. The silver of the Americas was the lubricant of the early modern world economy, and the ships that carried it across the Atlantic were, in the most literal possible sense, floating fortunes. The Spanish colonial system that protected this flow was organised around the principle of exclusion. Only Spanish ships and Spanish merchants could legally trade with Spanish colonial ports. The logic was straightforward. The profits of colonial trade should flow to Spain, not to the rival European nations that were watching the silver extraction with undisguised envy. The enforcement of this exclusion was the function of the armadas that escorted the floaters, the fortifications that guarded the colonial ports, and the Coast Guard vessels that patrolled the Caribbean looking for interlopers. In practice, the exclusion was imperfect. The Spanish Navy was never large enough to patrol every anchorage in the Caribbean effectively. The colonial governors, who were supposed to enforce the trade monopoly, were susceptible to the practical advantages of allowing some illegal trade to occur, particularly in goods that the official supply system provided erratically and expensively. And the non-Spanish European nations, above all England, France and the Netherlands, were unwilling to accept permanent exclusion from the Caribbean trade and pursued access through whatever combination of diplomacy, commerce, and force that the political moment offered. The Spanish claimed the entire Caribbean. They could not govern it all. The space between the claim and the reality was where Tortuga existed, and that space was also where the Buccaneer articles were written, where the brotherhood of the coast assembled itself from men who had no other community to belong to, where the specific and unrepeatable cultural world of the Caribbean buccaneers took its particular shape. That pattern of communities forming in the ungoverned spaces between imperial claims is not unique to Tortuga. It appears throughout history in the margins of empires that overreach their administrative capacity, the medieval frontier zones of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, the border regions of the Qing dynasty's expansion in Central Asia, the no-man's lands of colonial Africa. What makes Tortuga distinctive within this pattern is the speed and intensity of what it produced in its brief window of relevance, the concentrated drama of the Morgan raids, the extraordinary institutional innovation of the articles, the specific cultural synthesis of the Buccaneer tradition, and the clarity with which the historical record, fragmentary as it is, preserves the outline of that production. The Buccaneers themselves left almost nothing in writing. Men who operated outside the law are understandably disinclined to document their activities in detail, and most of what we know about them comes from sources that were, in various ways, hostile to their enterprise. Spanish colonial records documenting raids and damages, English and French administrative correspondence managing the political fallout of operations that created diplomatic complications, the legal proceedings generated by the prosecutions that followed the gradual criminalisation of the trade. Esquemling's book is the primary exception, and its reliability, as we have noted, is mixed. The gaps in the record are real, and they have been filled, repeatedly and energetically, by imagination, by the novelists and filmmakers and game designers who have found in the Buccaneer world a setting whose combination of freedom, violence, and moral ambiguity generates stories that the documentary record alone cannot fully satisfy. This is not a criticism of the imagination. The imagination works with what history provides, and what the history of Tortuga provides is a genuinely extraordinary set of materials, Real people of remarkable capability operating in genuinely dramatic circumstances in a place of specific and evocative geography. Henry Morgan was real. Jean Levasseur was real. The fort on the hill was real. The articles were real. The crossing of the isthmus was real. The bones of Panama City are real, still visible on the Pacific coast, still bearing the marks of the fire that ended the richest raid in Caribbean history. These materials are sufficient for imagination to work with, and the results, however freely they have departed from the documented facts, have kept the story alive in the cultural memory when it might otherwise have faded into the specialist journals. The night is settling in now, and the story of the Turtle Island has reached its proper end. Not the end of the place, which is still there and still inhabited, and still going about its business, but the end of the particular chapter that gave it its name in the memory of the Atlantic world. The harbour is quiet now. The smoked meat fires are long out. The ships that filled the anchorage in the summer of 1670, 36 of them, 2,000 men, before the crossing that ended Panama. Those ships are driftwood and barnacle somewhere on the floor of the Caribbean, and the men who sailed in them have been dust for 3.5 centuries. But the island is still shaped like a turtle from the sea, and the channel still runs between it and Hispaniola, and the trade still push across the water in all seasons, and the stone of Jean Levasseur's fort is still on the hill, overgrown and patient, remembering nothing and carrying everything. History works like that. The actors go and the stage remains, and occasionally, if you stand in the right place at the right time and look with the right kind of attention, you can feel the weight of what happened there pressing through the present and into your awareness. Not as memory, which requires someone to remember, but as something more like the shape that past events leave in the physical world, permanent in the way that only things that actually happened can be permanent. The Buccaneers of Tortuga chose their captains and wrote their articles and crossed the isthmus and took their prizes and spent their money and lived and died in the specific way that their specific world produced. And they did it in a window of historical time that was exactly as long as it needed to be and no longer. Then the window closed, as all windows close, and the island settled back into itself, and the fishermen came, and the Turtle Island went on being a turtle island without needing to be anything else. Let that settle around you now. The Caribbean is dark and warm tonight, and the stars that the Buccaneers steered by are in the same places they always were, which is to say exactly where they need to be. The harbour at Tortuga is quiet. The fort on the hill is holding its own council. The smoked meat fires are out. Rest easy.